Late on the afternoon of June 14th, 1931, a 59-year-old man named Dr. Adolf Ruth climbed off his donkey that he had been riding on for hours through the Superstition Mountains in Arizona. Once he was off the animal, the doctor shook his legs to work out the cramps, and then he just took in the scenery all around him. And as he did, he smiled. Now, to the average person, what Dr. Ruth was seeing in front of him would look very impressive. There were all these jagged peaks on either side of him that jutted straight up into the sky that almost looked so steep they could not even be climbed. And this mountain range was cut through all over with all these twisting and turning canyons that almost seemed like a maze. Also, high up in these mountains were all these caves where people used to live, but now they were abandoned. In fact, today, if you were to travel through the Superstition Mountains, you could go days without seeing another person. And that was true back in 1931 when Dr. Ruth was there. But Dr. Ruth knew that where he was standing right now between two towering rock walls was not just a regular desert canyon. This particular stretch of desert was about to make Dr. Ruth a very rich man. He was going to be the very first person to actually find the Lost Dutchman gold mine. This was the same Lost Dutchman gold mine that had claimed the lives of hundreds of other treasure seekers who had come into the Superstition Mountains and not come out again. But Dr. Ruth knew he had a special advantage that nobody else who had come out here looking had had. He had a treasure map that was going to show him exactly where this treasure was. And he knew it was right nearby. And without even thinking, he reached into his pack that was slung over his shoulder, and he felt the edges of the treasure map, which was folded up and tucked inside of his notebook. But as Dr. Ruth was daydreaming about finding this treasure, he heard someone grunt from behind him. And suddenly, Dr. Ruth pulled his hand out of his pack and he whipped his head around and he looked at the two cowboy guides who had brought him out here. And Dr. Ruth just said, "What?" In Dr. Ruth's daily life, he was a retired veterinarian and a government employee who worked in Washington, D.C. He was a small guy with glasses and he walked with a limp, and he knew these two cowboy guides of his just thought he was some frail old man. And this deeply offended Dr. Ruth. And so because the doctor totally resented these cowboys, he had told them that, "Yes, I need your help getting me to a particular spot in the desert, but once I get there, you guys are done. You can leave, I will pay you, and you can just go away. I will be fine on my own." And as it happened, they had reached this particular spot. And now Dr. Ruth is looking at these guys like, "All right, let's go. Get out of here. You do not need to be here anymore." But the cowboys, now that they were at this spot where they were supposed to go back home, they kind of hesitated before they left because they looked at Dr. Ruth and they did think he was kind of a frail old man, and they knew all about how all these people had died going into this canyon to look for this treasure. And so the cowboy who had kind of cleared his throat and made a noise to get Dr. Ruth to turn around, he chimed in and said, "You know, doctor, I do not know if this is a good idea for you to go in there on your own." And Dr. Ruth again is super offended, and he just says to the cowboy, "I am fine. Just go. I am going to set up camp. I am good. Get out of here." And then Dr. Ruth pulled out his wallet. He handed some money to the cowboys. The cowboys took the money. They looked at each other and just kind of shrugged. And then the cowboys turned around and began galloping away. And as they did, Dr. Ruth was standing there feeling kind of proud of himself for getting rid of these guys. But as they kind of faded into the distance, Dr. Ruth turned back around and he looked out at the landscape. And suddenly, now that he was actually all alone, a lot of his bravery was now gone. Now he was feeling maybe a little apprehensive. But Dr. Ruth reminded himself that he knew what he was doing. He was not a frail old man. Despite the way he looked, he could handle himself, and he certainly knew this area well. He had a map. He would be in and out. He would get that treasure, and then he would be rich and famous. And so with that in mind, Dr. Ruth grabbed his things off the ground. He hopped back on his donkey, and he began slowly marching his way deeper into the canyon. A little while later, as the sun was starting to set, Dr. Ruth decided it was time to stop. And so he stopped his donkey. He hopped off, he found a clearing by the side of the trail, and he began setting up his campsite. And then finally, once the canvas tent was all set up and his campsite was good to go, Dr. Ruth started a small fire, and then he rolled a small boulder in front of the fire and he sat down on it. And then he reached into his pack and he pulled out that notebook, and from inside the notebook, he pulled out the old fragile treasure map. Dr. Ruth's son had acquired this treasure map from a man in Mexico, and this man in Mexico apparently got it from a family that used to do mining in the Superstition Mountains. And they had drawn out this map before apparently they were all massacred inside of the Superstitions. But somehow or another, their map they had drawn about where they thought this treasure was had survived. And so Dr. Ruth's son had gotten this map and given it to Dr. Ruth. And so Dr. Ruth held the map up and he stared at it for a second. And as he did, he could not help but be drawn to this huge rock formation way off in the distance. So, not on the map, but actually in real life, basically far down the canyon, there was just this massive rock formation. And for a second, Dr. Ruth was looking at it thinking it kind of looked like a huge, oversized gravestone. And in a way, it kind of freaked him out, but he looked back at the map and he realized there actually was a drawing on this map that clearly represented this big rock formation. And on the map, it had an arrow pointing to this little drawing. And it said this big rock formation was called Weaver's Needle. And according to the map, apparently the treasure was right near Weaver's Needle. And so Dr. Ruth was like, great, tomorrow I will head straight for Weaver's Needle. I will find the treasure and I will be rich and famous. And on that note, Dr. Ruth folded the map up. He tucked it back into his notebook, put it back in his pack, and then he took his beans and meat off the fire and he began to eat. And as he did, he whistled periodically to fill the silence that was filling the entire canyon. By the time Dr. Ruth was done eating his food, it was totally dark inside of this canyon, like completely pitch black and silent. And as the doctor was kind of taking in this moment of absolute darkness and silence, he was startled by a sudden sound coming from high up one of the canyon walls. It sounded like hooves marching on stone, and it kind of echoed through the whole canyon. And for a second, Dr. Ruth felt relieved. Even though he had been adamant, especially to the two cowboy guides, that he wanted to go into this canyon by himself, now that he was here by himself and it was so dark and quiet and kind of spooky, he was glad to hear hooves because it meant that must be a person riding a horse, and so he was not alone anymore. But when Dr. Ruth called out and said, "Who is there?" there was no response, and there were no more hoof sounds. It just went totally quiet again. And then from all over the canyon, all Dr. Ruth heard was the yipping and howling of coyotes everywhere. By this point, Dr. Ruth could not help it. He felt terrified. And suddenly, all he was thinking about were all the stories he had heard about unseen predators lurking in the shadows, stalking people who come into this canyon. And so Dr. Ruth decided, you know what, I am just going to bed. And so he extinguished his fire. He packed up his things and he went inside of his tent and he laid down inside of his bedroll. And even though he knew he really was not actually safer in here, all he had was a canvas tent material protecting him from the outside world. But mentally being inside the tent, he just felt safer. And so Dr. Ruth would lay in his tent in the total darkness, kind of on edge for a while, wide awake, listening intently for more hoofbeats or something out there. But there were no more sounds. The night remained silent and dark, and eventually Dr. Ruth fell asleep. But in the middle of the night, Dr. Ruth suddenly woke up and it was totally dark and silent, and he sat up and he looked out of his tent. The flap was open, and at first he could not see anything. It just seemed like darkness out there. But then he realized, moving around very slightly, pretty far away from his tent, but not that far away, were two eyes staring at him, unblinking, just staring directly into his tent. And Dr. Ruth, his heart started to race, and he was realizing that an animal, a person, something is right there. And so Dr. Ruth, he was about to yell out when suddenly the eyes blinked and vanished. Dr. Ruth fumbled for his gun, and he drew it, and he aimed it out of the tent, and he yelled, "I will shoot if you come back. I will shoot." But there was nothing. Dr. Ruth would stay awake for at least a couple more hours, just anxiously staring out of his tent, wondering if this thing, this person, whatever it was nearby. But he never saw the eyes again, and there were no more sounds outside. And so eventually, Dr. Ruth did lay back down inside of his bedroll, and he went to sleep. When he woke up in the morning, Dr. Ruth immediately went outside and began walking out in the direction where he saw those eyes to see if he could find some tracks on the ground. In his head, he was hoping he would find a bunch of coyote tracks, and that would explain what these eyes were. Even though in the back of his head, he is thinking that did not look like a coyote. And so as Dr. Ruth began walking in that direction, he did begin to see loads of coyote tracks all over the place. And so he is thinking, there it is, it was a coyote. My brain is just playing tricks on me. But he got maybe 15 or 20 feet away from his tent, and he noticed there was another set of tracks that were not coyote tracks. They were human tracks, or what appeared to be human tracks, like barefoot feet tracks, except the size of them was really small, like a child's foot. Now, Dr. Ruth was a really small guy and wore a men's size 6, so he had very small feet. And for a second, Dr. Ruth thought, oh, maybe these are my footprints, but he was like, I was not over here and I was not walking around barefoot, so whose tracks were these? And then making it worse, Dr. Ruth noticed these little footprints, these little human-looking footprints. They walked all the way over to the side of his tent, and they appeared to circle his tent over and over again. But then the footprints did not wander off and disappear. It is almost like the footprints just continued in a circle, and then whatever this was making the footprints just stopped where it was and vanished. At this point, Dr. Ruth was terrified, and he decided, let's just go towards Weaver's Needle. Let's find this treasure and get out of here. And so he rushed back to his tent. He gathered up his things, he hopped back on his donkey, and he began heading towards Weaver's Needle, the thing that looked like a big gravestone. After riding for a couple of hours, Dr. Ruth was close enough to this huge formation that he was actually inside of the shadow cast by this Weaver's Needle. And when Dr. Ruth consulted his map, he saw that where the treasure was supposedly located was actually within the shadow of Weaver's Needle, and so he knew he was close. And so Dr. Ruth continued following the map as best he could. He turned this corner behind a rock formation, and then right up ahead he saw this big wall of cacti that all had these axe heads lodged into their flesh. Like someone had taken an axe and smacked the axe head in and then broken off the handle, but like dozens of times. And so Dr. Ruth stopped and he was looking at these cacti. And then he looked at the map and he realized on the map was actually a drawing that kind of resembled these cacti with the axe heads in them. And so he is thinking, oh my goodness, this map is accurate. I have found another landmark. I must be near the treasure. And so now all he had to do was kind of back up and orient these cacti with the axe heads in them with Weaver's needle and its shadow. And if he could just orient it correctly, he would know exactly where to go. And after backing up and moving the map around a couple of times, he finally had it totally oriented. And he realized there was a path straight up ahead that would go right to the base of Weaver's needle. And he thought, that is it. That is where I dig. There is the treasure. And so, feeling excited, Dr. Ruth hopped off the donkey. He grabbed his pickaxe and he began moving in the direction of where he was going to dig. But before he got there, he heard something behind him. He turned to look, but by the time he saw whatever was behind him, it was already too late. An explosion rang out, and then everything went dark. 10 days later, those two cowboy guides who had brought Dr. Ruth into the Superstition Mountains, they came back out to check on him to make sure he was okay. And they found his campsite, and it was abandoned. And they searched the entire area all the way down to Weaver's Needle and back, and there was no trace of Dr. Ruth. Over the next 45 days, a much larger search party was launched in this area to try to find Dr. Ruth. But at the end of those 45 days, there still was no sign of Dr. Ruth. And so the search was called off, and it was assumed that Dr. Ruth was dead. 3.5 months after that big search ended, so in December of 1931, another set of explorers was in the Superstition Mountains near Weaver's Needle, the big gravestone-looking rock formation, and they would discover a human skull on the ground. It was Dr. Ruth's skull, and it had 2 gaping holes in the side of it. A month after that, another set of explorers who were in the Superstition Mountains would find the rest of Dr. Ruth's skeleton located approximately 1 mile away from where his head had been found. But while the discovery of Dr. Ruth's body did provide some closure for his family, it actually only deepened the mystery of what the heck was going on in the Superstition Mountains. Because, first, despite the fact that Dr. Ruth's skull had been found with 2 holes in it and the fact that his skull was found 1 mile away from the rest of his skeleton, authorities who investigated his death quickly said Dr. Ruth died of natural causes and they closed the case. And the second weird thing that only deepened the mystery was when they were searching Dr. Ruth's campsite, they would find his checkbook. And inside of his checkbook, there was all this writing that was clearly from Dr. Ruth writing his checks. And then towards the back of this book, there was a relatively fresh-looking message. And the handwriting looked totally different than Dr. Ruth's handwriting. It just said Veni, Vidi, Vici, which in Latin means, I came, I saw, I conquered. Now, we do not know who wrote this message, but the running theory is whoever likely killed Dr. Ruth wrote this note inside of his checkbook, but we do not know why they wrote this note. Now, eventually people began to think that because of this note that was in his checkbook, that suggests that maybe Dr. Ruth really was on the precipice of actually finally finding this treasure, and maybe the stories were right about the Superstition Mountains, that something lurks in the canyon protecting this treasure, and when it saw Dr. Ruth was about to take the treasure, this thing killed Dr. Ruth to stop him. Meaning they came, saw, and conquered Dr. Ruth, also adding to the strangeness of this entire story in 1945, so 13 years after Dr. Ruth's skeleton was discovered, an adventurer named Barry Storm published a book about his journey to try to figure out what actually happened to Dr. Ruth. And he would say in this book that when he went into the Superstition Mountains, somebody started firing a gun at him from off in the distance. And after taking cover and looking, he could not see anybody. And then when he began taking steps farther into the canyon to continue to explore, the shots rang out again. And so Barry Storm ultimately fled the Superstition Mountains. And he would tell people that whoever was out there shooting at him, it seemed like they were shooting warning shots at him like, if you come any closer, I will kill you. To this day, no one has ever actually found any hidden treasure in the Superstition Mountains. But about 9,000 people will go out there looking for the treasure every single year. On May 21st, 1941, Betty Albright and her 3-year-old son Eldridge traveled to her mother's house in rural Woodstock, Maryland. Betty had asked her mother if she would look after her son for the afternoon so Betty could catch up on some much-needed sleep. They arrived at Betty's mother's house at about 1:30, and right away, Betty went inside, handed her son to her mom, and went upstairs to take a nap. As for Eldridge and his grandmother, they went out in the backyard to play. Now, Eldridge loved going to his granny's house because she had this enormous backyard for him to play in. If he were standing on her back porch looking out, it would be 250 meters of just open grass for him to run around in. And it abutted up against this huge forest. And in the middle of her property, looking straight out at the forest, there was this 3-meter gap in the trees that if you walked through it, it would bring you down to this creek bed that was seasonal. And there was very rarely any water running through it. From the porch, anyone that was standing in this creek bed could clearly be seen. And so Eldridge was allowed to play in the creek bed so long as he did not go right or left in the creek, which would put him out of view from anybody on the porch. And so this particular day, when Eldridge and his grandmother went outside, Eldridge wanted to go play in the creek bed. So he immediately started running across the yard towards it along with his grandmother's 3 dogs. As for his grandmother, she just did not have it in her to go all the way down to the creek bed. So she decided she would just sit on the porch and read a book and keep her eye on Eldridge. She remembers watching her grandson go all the way across the yard, get to the break in the trees, and then step down into the creek bed where he began goofing around with the dogs and throwing rocks and having a good time clearly in view. And for the next 5 to 10 minutes, she just stared directly at her grandson and the dogs. And at some point, she picked up the book next to her and she began reading the book and then periodically looking up to check on her grandson and then back down to the book. At about 2 p.m., she was looking down at her book when she heard her grandson yell out for help. Now, 3-year-olds yell out for help all the time. Sometimes it is a big deal and sometimes it is not such a big deal, but oftentimes the sound of their voice gives away how serious it is. No matter what they say, it is like their tone gives away whether you should take this seriously or if this is just a kid being a 3-year-old. And she would say that the way he was yelling sounded like a real emergency. When she poked her head up, even though she had seen him less than a minute ago playing in the gap in the trees, now she is looking and he and the dogs are gone, and so, of course, she is alarmed. She hops out of her seat, she goes down the steps, and she starts walking across the yard towards Eldridge. And she is yelling his name, and she is walking quickly. When she got about halfway across the yard, she heard Eldridge yell out again. Except this time, his voice was coming from way off in the forest, way farther away from the last time he had yelled out. It gave the impression to her that he had moved a great distance from the last time he yelled to her. And it triggered something inside of her that was telling her something is terribly wrong. And she began running towards the creek bed. Still no sign of the dogs. She cannot see anything. She is just running towards the creek bed. When she gets about 10 meters away from the break in the trees, she hears her grandson yell out for a 3rd time, barely audible, way off in the forest. He yells out for help. And as he is yelling, it sounds like someone has stifled him and covered his mouth mid-yell. So she runs through the break in the trees down to the creek bed where she stops. And she looks out in front of her and it is just dense forest, and there is no Eldridge, there are no dogs, there is nothing. She looks to her right down the creek bed and there is nothing down there. And then she looks to her left and one of her dogs is in the creek bed, maybe 10 meters away, facing away from her, and the dog is positioned in such a way that it is clearly looking at something. And so she runs down to the dog, thinking she is going to see maybe Eldridge or the other dogs, but there is nothing beyond the dog. The dog is just rooted to the spot. Its hair is raised. It is growling, and it is taking little steps back like it has been spooked at whatever it has seen or whatever it is looking at. And she just looked up and tried to look in the direction the dog was looking. But there was nothing. It was just forest. And so at this point, she felt certain that someone must have abducted Eldridge. And so she tries to pull the dog to come with her, but the dog is not budging. And so she runs back to the house to wake up Eldridge's mother. The two of them come back down to the creek bed. The dog is still in the same position, growling and staring in the same direction as if whatever it was looking at has not gone anywhere. And they look for a couple more minutes. They are yelling for Eldridge, and the grandmother is telling her daughter, "Look, I think he has been abducted. We got to call the authorities." And finally she relents. And so they do manage to get the dog. They run back to the house and they call the police. Shortly thereafter, the state police showed up with this huge contingent of searchers, and they immediately went down to the creek bed where they started pushing predominantly to the left side, which is where the dog was angled, and it was also where the grandmother had heard her grandson yelling from. And very quickly, police discover some of Eldridge's footprints about 50 meters down on the left side of the creek bed. They were in some sand right at the edge, and they were walking away as if he was leaving the area he had been told to stay in, which was in that gap in the trees. But interestingly, the footprints, it looked like he had been walking for maybe 20 or 30 meters when inexplicably the prints just stop as if he stopped in the sand where he was. But had he gone right, left, straight, turned around, had he gone in any direction, there would have been additional prints in the sand. But there were not, which gave the impression that was where someone must have lifted him up and kidnapped him. But they never found any prints connected to a kidnapper. For the rest of the day and that night, they would not find any more signs of Eldridge or the other 2 missing dogs. The next day, about 24 hours after Eldridge had gone missing, there were a number of search crews that had gone well outside of the primary search area in hopes of maybe finding one of the 2 lost dogs, because they thought maybe they could bring them to the lost child. And this one crew that was 4 miles away from where Eldridge had gone missing, they were walking past a swamp when one of them heard what sounded like a child whimpering, and it was coming from inside the swamp. And so immediately they turn and start walking into the swamp, which had fairly deep water. And they get to this clearing and they see there is this rocky overhang with high grass all around it, kind of forming like a cave. and they hear this whimpering again, and it is coming from underneath that rock, and they rush over and they are pulling the grass aside, and sure enough, tucked underneath this rock inside of this kind of makeshift cave is Eldridge. He was laying on this really well-constructed bed of leaves that looked like an animal's den. So either Eldridge had found an animal's den or he had built himself this beautiful bed of leaves. When they approached him, he was sleeping underneath this rock, and so that whimpering sound he was making, he must have been making in his sleep. And so as they got closer to him, he woke up and he kind of sat up and he was very groggy and confused. All of his clothes were really badly torn up and he was not wearing any shoes, but he overall seemed okay. He just was very confused seeming. And so they scooped him up and they brought him back to search headquarters, reunited him with his mother and his grandmother, and everyone is just so relieved that he is alive, but at the same time people were like, how did he get 4 miles away in the middle of a swamp? And so after the doctor cleared him, saying he was okay besides some scratches and bruises, the police along with the mother and the grandmother sat down with Eldridge and asked him, what happened? But unfortunately, Eldridge appeared to not know this had even happened. He did not even know he had spent 24 hours out in the middle of the woods by himself. It was like he had blacked the whole thing out. Because Eldridge was found alive and unharmed, the police did not continue to investigate this case. And so, we do not know what caused him to suddenly be yelling for help and appear to be drifting farther and farther into the woods. We do not know what the dog saw in the creek that scared it so badly. We do not know how Eldridge moved 4 miles through a dense forest over multiple swamps, only to wind up in yet another swamp inside of a cave. Although the police came out and said Eldridge must have just wandered off on his own, basically everybody involved in this case believes someone or something abducted him. It is just very fortunate he was found alive. Unfortunately, there is no clarification about what happened to the other 2 dogs. Although the way it is worded in the story, it does sound like they were never found. In the 1950s, the Thorpe family lived in Dunbar, Pennsylvania, which was a small town of less than 1,000 people. Their house was on a very quiet street with very few neighbors anywhere near them, and their property was right up against this forest that was right in their backyard. Their daughter, 2-year-old Anna, loved to play in their backyard, but she was instructed to stay on the grass section of their backyard and not venture into the forest because the forest was snake-infested and Anna was terrified of snakes, and so she happily obliged. On May 5th, 1950, Anna was playing in her backyard in that grassy section, and her mother was in the kitchen looking out the back window into the backyard, and her mother looked down for a second when she heard her daughter scream. She looked up, and Anna was gone. She immediately ran outside, and she is yelling for her daughter. She is looking all around, and she knows she must have gone into the forest, and she is thinking to herself, she must have been bit by a snake, and she is laying on the ground somewhere. That is why I cannot see her. And so she runs into the forest, and she is screaming for her daughter, and she is not getting any response. She is starting to panic. All her yelling has gotten the attention of her 2 older sons who were in the house. They come running outside and they join the search and they start fanning out and they are looking for Anna, and she is just gone. And so after only a few minutes of looking, Anna's mother decides she has to call the police. The police show up and they launch this massive search, and word got out to the residents of Dunbar that one of their own had gone missing, a child no less. And so virtually everyone in Dunbar showed up to be a part of the search. And they combed that whole forest behind their property, and there was just no sign of Anna. After the first 24 hours had gone by and they had not found any sign of Anna, they decided to expand the search area from a 1-mile radius to a 3-mile radius. And within just hours of this change, there was a crew that was 3 miles away from where Anna had gone missing. And they found Anna, and she was alive. She was laying under this blackberry bush. All she had on was a single shoe. Next to her was a pile of clothes. When they went up to her, she seemed okay. They picked her up and they brought her back to the search headquarters where they reunited her with her parents. A doctor looked at her and the doctor said, there are no signs that she was attacked. There are really no signs of any wear and tear on her at all. It does not even look like she was outside for the past 24 hours. When Anna was asked about what happened to her, she was not able to give any sort of meaningful answer because she was only 2 years old. But the reason this case is included in today's story is not because, she vanished mysteriously in the forest and that she was actually found 3 miles away versus 1, or, that she was found with just a shoe on. The reason it is included is because for her to have been found where she was found, the only way for her to have arrived at that spot was if she crossed 10 barbed wire fences. There was no other way for her to have gotten there. The only other way would have been a massive detour that she literally could not have covered. An adult probably could not have covered that distance in the amount of time given. So, this 2-year-old with no scratches on her body is found on the other side of 10 barbed wire fences. I mean, even if you take the barbed wire off of the fence, a 2-year-old climbing a large fence, that alone is kind of a Herculean task. And to do it without scratching your body, it is truly impossible. A May 7th article in the Los Angeles Times said the police were baffled by this 10-fence dilemma. And they said the only way it would make sense is if she had been abducted and dumped there. But the police also repeatedly said there was no evidence to suggest she had been abducted or attacked or harmed in any way. It was just where she was found did not add up. Ultimately, the police came out with a statement saying this had to have been an accident, that Anna, the 2-year-old, managed to just somehow walk her way past all these fences and was found where she was. And thank goodness she is alive, but interestingly, the police confiscated her clothing and would not give that back to the parents, indicating there was further investigation happening even though the child had been found. But unfortunately, the police never revealed whether or not they actually discovered anything else about this case. And like in the Eldridge case, Anna's parents did not press for more information about what happened to their daughter because she was found alive and unharmed. Now, Anna's case might seem like some crazy anomaly, and that is all it is. But this is not the first time something like this has happened in this small area in Pennsylvania. 2 years earlier, and less than 10 miles away from where Anna went missing, another 2-year-old, Ronald Collier, also went missing in the same stretch of woods. His mother had been sitting with him on their back porch, which overlooked the same forest, and at some point his mother had gone inside, leaving Ronald sitting on one of the seats. When she came back out again, Ronald was gone. His mother estimated that she was inside for maybe 10 or 15 seconds tops. The police and the community came out in force, and they combed through the woods and they could not find any sign of Ronald. And the police got really frustrated with Ronald's parents because they felt like this is impossible. How could this child not turn up considering the timeline you have given us, which is you went inside for 10 to 15 seconds and your son is now completely gone? He has completely vanished. Like, you must have something to do with this. And so the police made Ronald's parents take polygraph tests, and his parents passed all of it. The search for Ronald continued for several weeks, but unfortunately it was ultimately terminated and they never found him. People in the area believed someone or something, maybe a bear or some other animal, was lurking in the tree line and watching Ronald. And as soon as his mother went in the house, they ran up and snatched the child and ran away with him. However, the police came out and said there was no evidence to back up that this child had been kidnapped, that what is far more likely is Ronald just got up and walked away and disappeared. However, 2 years later, when Anna's case happened, these similarities between her case and Ronald's case were just too much for locals to overlook. And so people began saying, it looks like Anna was abducted and placed where she was ultimately found inside of those woods. And so probably whoever or whatever took Anna is the same person or thing that took Ronald, but Anna was just lucky enough to survive. Although this mystery predator theory is just that, a theory, it does seem more likely than Ronald in 15 seconds getting up and running off into oblivion, never to be found again, and Anna scaling 10 barbed wire fences in a 24-hour period without a scratch on her body. Unfortunately, though, we will probably never know the truth. From 2002 to 2006, Cullen Finery was perhaps the most successful college quarterback in history, winning 3 national championships and being named the Division II Player of the Decade. He was also perhaps the toughest college quarterback in history. Most quarterbacks will spend their careers looking to avoid getting smashed by defenders. Not Cullen. Cullen was 6'2", 240 pounds, and he would tell his teammates that he wanted to get hit and he would hit back. And his coaches hated it about him, but his teammates loved this about him. Cullen was also famous for playing through injuries. His junior year in college, he broke his collarbone and he did not tell anyone, and he played through an entire playoff series that he won. After college, Cullen's professional football career was not nearly as successful as his amateur one. He played briefly for 2 NFL football teams, the Baltimore Ravens and the Denver Broncos. But when he was not getting any playing time and he just could see the writing on the wall that this was not going to be a match, he was not going to make it in the NFL, he left for Europe to play in a European football league. But when his European football career started to sputter out as well around 2009, he came back to the United States where he joined a very small-time indoor arena football league. And while Cullen's love of football was still there as much as it ever was, he knew at this point, playing at this low of a level, that his career was effectively over. Around the same time that Cullen was hanging up his football cleats, he would meet Jennifer, who would become his wife. She was an all-state volleyball player and in many ways was just as competitive and as athletic as Cullen was. They were kind of like a perfect match for each other. They married in 2010, and Cullen, this big man, big-time quarterback, was shaking and crying at the altar because he was so nervous and excited about marrying Jennifer. Because I think this was a really big turning point for him, where he was basically putting football in the past and starting this new life and building a family with Jennifer, and he was really excited about it. The newlywed couple moved into a house together in Michigan where they had 2 kids, and Cullen landed a good job in medical sales. And by all accounts, Cullen was just hitting his stride post-football. On Memorial Day weekend in 2013, Jennifer's family was planning this 3-day fishing trip along the Baldwin River in Michigan, and the Finarities decided they would join them. And so Cullen and his wife and kids, they rented a cabin that was going to be near the campsite that Jennifer's family was staying at. And for the entire weekend, it was just this great fishing trip where everybody had a great time and the weather was beautiful. And on May 26th, so the last night of this 3-day fishing trip, Cullen, who had recently purchased this pontoon boat that they had used for this fishing trip, he wanted to just go out one more time on his boat, this boat that he was really proud of, and fish for another 30 to 45 minutes before ending the weekend. So Cullen put on his waders and his jacket. He grabbed his fishing pole and he had his family drive him to the stairs that led down to the water where his pontoon boat was before he walked down the steps. He turned and told his family that he would be out for about 30 to 45 minutes, and that he wanted to be picked up at the next boat ramp down the way, and that he would call when he needed a ride. 42 minutes later at 9:27 p.m., Jennifer receives a phone call from her husband, and she is expecting it to be the call where he says, "Okay, I am ready to get picked up." But when she answers the phone, Cullen is frantic, and he is telling her that he is being followed by 2 men in the tree line, that he is out on the water on his pontoon, but there are 2 men in the tree line that he cannot see, but he can hear them, and they have been following him for some time. And before Jennifer can even get a word out, Cullen says to her that he is going to beach the boat and take his clothes off, and then he hangs up. Jennifer immediately tries calling Cullen back repeatedly, but he is not picking up, and so she is left feeling totally confused about what her husband has just told her. But what stood out to her was how scared he sounded on the phone, and fear was not something she typically associated with Cullen. This beast of a man, this tough football player, he did not get scared. So for him to be that scared sounding and to be describing people basically stalking him, she knew he was in serious trouble. So she calls 911 and she describes where he is in the Baldwin River, and the police take her report and say, "We will send someone out right away." After Jennifer got off the phone with police, she called her family and told them about this really strange phone call from Cullen and how she had just called the police and she did not know what to do. And so her brother tried calling Cullen. And Cullen answered, and when he did, Matt said, "Hey, Cullen, where are you?" And Cullen would say, "I do not know where I am, but there are these 2 guys that are still following me." And Matt would say, "Are you still on your boat? Are you on land?" And all Cullen said is, "It is getting pretty rough out here." And then he hung up. Afterwards, Matt would call Jen and he would tell her about this phone call with Cullen. And it really did not add any clarity to the situation. And so Jen and her family decide the best thing they can do is go to the boat ramp where Cullen had said he wanted to be picked up in hopes that maybe he would make his way there and they would find him. So Jennifer and her family head out to this location and Cullen is not there. They get out, they are yelling for him. There is no sign of him. And shortly after, a police car would show up because this was one of the areas where Jennifer had said when she spoke to police that Cullen might be. And so the police officer gets out. They take an official statement from Jennifer, and at this point they file an official missing person report. Before the police began looking for Cullen, they reached out to his wireless service provider and they asked them to ping his cell phone from the tower. Any service provider has the ability to roughly triangulate the location of a cell phone based on the last few locations of the phone. The last 4 locations that the service provider pinged for Cullen were up to 4 miles apart from each other, which was bizarre in its own way because the idea that in a very rugged, rough area in a very short amount of time that Cullen had been moving 4, 5, 6, 7 miles just to get to these different points, that did not really make sense. But also, when they looked at these points on a map, it looked like each of them was either near a paved road or in order to get to them, you would have had to cross a paved road. And so they are thinking to themselves, why does he keep moving point to point if at any one of these locations he is near relative safety? But as strange as these 4 locations were, the police now had a really solid starting point. So they dispatched people to each of these points and they began combing along the river where he had last been seen. And within an hour, they discovered his boat. It was a little ways down from where he had been dropped off. It was missing an oar and it was basically beached on the side of the river. It was not clear if it had been intentionally beached, but Cullen was not in it. And when they searched around the area, they could not find any sign that Cullen was in the area. They were yelling for him. He was not yelling back. Interestingly, a man who owned property near where the pontoon boat was found reported to police hearing screaming or yelling coming from the area where the boat was found around the same time that Cullen went missing. But despite this piece of information, it did not actually help them discover where Cullen actually went. For the next 48 hours, police and hundreds of people searched in the areas where his cell phone had pinged and along the river where his pontoon had been found, but there was no sign of him. Then, on the evening of May 28th, approximately 48 hours after Cullen had gone missing, they discovered his body. It was located less than a half-mile away from a paved road, and it was situated in between those 4 points that the cell phone provider had given. He was laying completely face down with his right arm under his body and his left arm over his head, clutching some grass. When they rolled him over, he had some blood coming out of his nose, but besides that, there was no significant trauma anywhere on his body. Cullen appeared to be wearing all of his clothes. However, it was noted that the strap on his waders was really badly twisted. Now, if he had never taken his clothes off, that would have been something he would have fixed. It would have been very uncomfortable when he started this trip to go fishing. That would have been something he would have fixed. Now, he said to his wife on the phone that he was going to be taking his clothes off, which there was no explanation for that, but he clearly said that to his wife, and she reported that to police. And so, some have speculated that between that phone call and finding him with the twisted strap on his waders, that indicates that perhaps his clothes did come off at some point over the past couple of days and were put back on again, either by him or by someone else. His cell phone had also been found in his front pocket, indicating that those cell phone pings had been his actual location. Initially, Cullen's autopsy was completely inconclusive. There was no trauma to his body, there was no obvious thing that killed him, but later on it was determined he died of pneumonia caused by inhaling his own vomit. So, we do not know how you get to a place where you are inhaling your own vomit, but I would imagine you are in a pretty panicked state of mind if that could happen to you. Many people believe Cullen's death was the result of a traumatic brain injury caused by all the years of playing football and getting hit in the head, and so that can lead to paranoia. And so perhaps this was a fit of paranoia. He got turned around, he got scared, he thought somebody was chasing him, and then, he vomits and inhales his vomit, and that ultimately kills him. And in 2011, Cullen had briefly shown signs of being a little bit paranoid when one day he thought someone was following him, and he actually went to a family member's house and said, "I think someone is following me." But he could never identify where this person was or who they were. But even if this was a fit of paranoia and no one was following him in the woods, well, why did he not stop on the paved road every time he crossed it? Because that would have represented safety. I mean, in 2011, when he supposedly had another fit of paranoia, his instincts were to go to a family member and to seek help. And so, you would think his instincts in this situation would be similar. He would seek help, he would seek safety. But he continuously left safety. He left the road, he left his boat. His boat was safety. Why did he leave his boat? Then even if we turn this around and we say, no, it was not a fit of paranoia, that he was in fact being followed by someone or something in the woods, well then why would that prompt him to call his wife and say, "I am going to get out of the boat and take my clothes off," and then proceed to walk 4, 5, 6, 7 miles in a very short period of time, crossing over a paved road at least 1 or 2 times and not stopping, not signaling for help? That does not make sense either. And what was that screaming that resident heard coming from the area where the pontoon boat was found? Unfortunately, there are many questions in this case, and the vast majority of them will go on. On January 28, 1976, Daniel Halse was born in a small town in Oregon called Estacada, which is located about 30 miles southeast of Portland. Daniel's family owned a farm, and so from a young age, Daniel became accustomed to getting up super early and helping out with daily chores. This childhood experience on the farm instilled in Daniel a strong work ethic. And it also taught Daniel to really appreciate family because the family he had grown up in spent all their time together and they all struggled and worked together every day to make ends meet. In high school, Daniel really began to blossom. He had this wonderful energy and huge radiant smile that drew people to him. And he was just one of those people that was just naturally gifted at everything he did. And it seemed totally effortless. During his high school years, he picked up playing the piano as well as the drums, and his classmates affectionately nicknamed him Drummer Dan. Daniel was also amazing with anything to do with computers or technology, and Daniel was just very handsome and very athletic and fit, and so he was really the guy that everybody wanted to be. But despite having all of these things going for him, Daniel was dealt a major blow in 1994 when he was in his junior year of high school. That year, his father, who he was quite close with, died unexpectedly from a brain aneurysm. This was a crushing blow for a young man who still very much leaned on his father for guidance and support. But Daniel, like the rest of his family, found a way to just keep on going despite this immense heartbreak. In 1995, so a year after his father's death, Daniel would graduate high school and he would head to Salem, Oregon, where he would go to school and earn his bachelor's degree in music. And then he would stick around in Salem at another university and he would earn his master's in business. And it was during those years that he was in Salem that Daniel would meet a young woman named Elizabeth Schwartach who had grown up in Salem. She, like Daniel, was incredibly hardworking and was just naturally good at everything she tried. She was also a model, and so when she and Daniel began dating, they genuinely looked like this beautiful Hollywood couple. In 2001, which was shortly after Daniel had earned his master's degree, he and Elizabeth got married. 5 years later, the couple, who now were the proud parents of 3 young children, 2 girls and a boy, they moved to Las Vegas because Daniel had found work there. Daniel had founded this computer IT company because he was so skilled with computers and it was really starting to thrive. And many of his clients were in or around Las Vegas, but just a few years after getting settled in Las Vegas, it would be Elizabeth's career ambitions that would take center stage in the family. Elizabeth had always wanted to get into politics, and in 2010, she decided she would run for a state Senate seat in Nevada. But in order to do that, she would need to campaign really aggressively, which would mean she would be gone a lot of the time. And so Daniel, who was working full-time with this computer company, he would need to keep doing that because that paid the bills, but he would also have to become the primary parent for their 3 children. And so when she approached Daniel and said, I really want to do this, but it requires a lot out of you. Are you willing to do this? Daniel was completely supportive and actually really excited at the idea. He had no problems whatsoever. And so very soon, Elizabeth would be out on the road campaigning and trying to win the state Senate seat. And Daniel would be home goofing around with the kids and taking them hiking and going to playgrounds and parks. And then after he would put the kids to bed at night, he would stay up super late and run his computer business out of their dining room. And all this additional hard work and sacrifice that Daniel was making for his wife paid off when later that year on November 2nd, Elizabeth, who had run this incredible campaign that was built on family values and wholesomeness and morality, she would win the state Senate seat, which shocked the state of Nevada. And even more impressive, she would become the youngest woman to ever be elected to Nevada legislature at just 27 years old. So it was clear to everyone in Nevada and also outside of Nevada that Elizabeth was destined for greatness. She was going to be the next big political superstar, and anyone who was close to the Halst family knew Daniel was her #1 cheerleader. He was so proud of her, but soon, the Halst's perfect life would come crumbling down. It was not long after Elizabeth had won her election that Daniel began to notice she was becoming suspiciously close with another man named Tiger Helgelund, who was a former golf pro and fellow rising political star. After noticing his wife constantly texting with Tiger, Daniel would actually reach out to Tiger directly and beg him to stop messaging his wife and to just leave his family alone. But the texting and the calling and the interactions between those two would not stop. And then finally in October of 2011, so less than a year into Elizabeth's first term as a state senator, Daniel would find out that his wife and Tiger had been away together alone on this long extended work trip. And so Daniel realized that almost certainly his wife was having an affair. And so when his wife came home from this trip and she was unpacking in their bedroom, Daniel walked into the room and he accused her of being unfaithful. And the argument that ensued got very heated, but it did not become physically violent. Basically, Daniel just screamed and yelled at Elizabeth, swearing at her and kind of losing his temper completely. But at some point, Elizabeth just said, "Daniel, stop." And Daniel would actually stop. And in fact, both Elizabeth and Daniel, when they recalled this night, would say as soon as she said stop, Daniel stopped yelling and he left the room. Over the next couple of days, Daniel and Elizabeth would go to therapy sessions at their church, indicating that they both were making a concerted effort to try to salvage their marriage. But on October 21st, 5 days after this big blow-up fight about the affair, Elizabeth would go to police and she would claim Daniel had touched her inappropriately during the fight they had over the affair. And so Daniel, much to his shock, was arrested and charged with something called open and gross lewdness, which is effectively unwanted touching of another person. This accusation is quite common, especially amongst people at bars who are drinking. There is lots of unwanted touching that can happen there. But interestingly, this particular charge is cited as being one of the more frequently falsely accused offenses because the police do not require any physical proof to actually arrest someone. Basically, people are in theory able to get other people arrested simply by claiming they inappropriately touched them, even if there is not a shred of proof. It is basically one person's word against the other. After being found guilty of open and gross lewdness, Daniel was sentenced to 6 months of probation, anger management, and he had to register as a sex offender. Shortly after he was found guilty, Daniel filed for divorce. Their divorce, which was heavily centered on who gets custody of their 3 kids, was very contentious. It was very bitter, and it was very public. Because Elizabeth was a state senator, she was in the public eye. And because her campaign that she had run on to get elected was built entirely on wholesomeness and family values and having good moral character, when rumors started to fly that she had had this affair with Tiger Helgelund and that had blown up her family and her husband was being charged with open and gross lewdness, it was just so salacious that despite her denying that she ever had this affair and acting like she was in the right, she was still forced to resign from her state Senate seat in February of 2012. The divorce would finalize later that year, and most likely because of Daniel's new sex offender status from the open and gross lewdness charge, he was denied custody of the 3 children, despite the fact that for the last several years he had been the everyday primary parent. So, Elizabeth, she gets custody of all 3 kids, and she promptly leaves Nevada to go to Alaska with her 3 kids to live with Tiger Helgelund, the man she denied having an affair with. And shortly after arriving in Alaska, she married Tiger Helgeland. Daniel was heartbroken. It was like his life had blown up in a matter of seconds. But most devastating of all was that his kids, who he called his three little angels, were now so far away from him he could not even see them if he wanted to. But just like he had done back in 1994 when his father passed away, Daniel just found a way to keep on going despite this horrible pain he was feeling. Over the next few years, Daniel would pour himself into his computer business and really make that his full-time effort, and he would make every effort to see his children any chance he got. But because his relationship with his ex-wife Elizabeth was not good, it was really difficult to see his kids. Eventually, Daniel would meet another woman named Bogdana, and they would actually get married. And when that happened, it seemed like in the eyes of Daniel's family, he was starting to kind of finally get his life back on track. Around this time, Daniel began sharing more and more of his life on his social media channels. And every post he made, and he made lots of them nearly every day, was so overwhelmingly positive and optimistic. And it really showcased his wonderful personality that was all about lifting up your fellow person and just being a good human being. And he also posted loads of videos of him goofing around with his three kids because he adored his kids. They were the most important thing to him by far. But despite having this very cheerful outward presence on social media privately, Daniel was dealt yet another very difficult blow in 2019 when his marriage to Bogdana, his second wife, fell apart. And so once again, Daniel was all alone. His social media posts around the time of the second divorce remained positive and very optimistic for the most part. But anytime you saw an image of Daniel actually facing the camera, you could just see a distinct sadness in his eyes. But just as quickly as it seemed like once again Daniel's life was just going to crumble, something truly amazing happened for Daniel. Daniel's first ex-wife Elizabeth and their three kids decided to leave Alaska and come back to Nevada and resettle in Las Vegas. This was not because Elizabeth wanted to rekindle with Daniel, it was just because she and the kids liked living in Las Vegas and wanted to come back. And as soon as they were back, Daniel suddenly got to see his kids all the time. He was so excited and so happy. In fact, by late 2020, Daniel's youngest daughter, Sierra, who was 16, she had basically just moved in with Daniel, even though legally speaking, she was not supposed to be doing that, and her mom, Elizabeth, was totally unhappy about it. But regardless, that was just how it was. She was living with Daniel in August of that year. So around the time that Sierra had basically moved back in with Daniel decided to take his ex-wife Elizabeth back to court to see if he could get custody of Sierra because Sierra was the only minor of their three children. She was still 16, and at that point, Sierra was already living with him. During the recorded video sessions between Daniel, Elizabeth, and the judge, Daniel would tell the judge that life in Elizabeth's home was totally toxic and not good for his children, and certainly not good for Sierra. Daniel would explain to the judge that Sierra was really struggling with some mental health issues, and what she needed right now was professional therapy, something he had already enrolled her in since she had moved back in with him. Daniel also presented to the judge a letter that he said Sierra wrote that basically backed up the idea that she is better off living with her father. Elizabeth would generally respond to all of these things that Daniel was saying by saying Daniel was a liar and that he was not fit to be a parent, and that letter that he claimed Sierra wrote does not sound like her, insinuating that, the letter was forged. The judge, who at regular intervals would get very frustrated with both Daniel and Elizabeth, finally would just say, look, you have got all sorts of issues between the two of you, and it is creating a horrible environment for your kids, and if you do not find a way to come to some sort of compromise, the people that are going to suffer are your kids, specifically Sierra. Finally, in early 2021, when Daniel and Elizabeth still had not come to terms, the judge just ordered that Daniel return Sierra to her mother's residence, because legally speaking, Sierra was supposed to be in her mother's care. And so begrudgingly, Daniel would take Sierra and he would bring her back to her mother's house and he would say, okay, go see your mother. And then he would drive off. But later that night, Sierra would sneak out of her mother's house and just run back to be with her dad. Needless to say, Daniel was not unhappy about that turn of events. The custody battle over Sierra continued to rage for the next several months, with Sierra opting to still remain at her father's place despite the court order, despite her mother pleading with her to come home. And then in April of 2021, something very odd happened. On the morning of April 8th, several $100s was withdrawn from Daniel's bank account from a few different ATMs around Las Vegas. This particular bank account was shared between Daniel and his second ex-wife, Bogdana. They just had not gotten around to relinquishing control to one or the other. And so these particular withdrawals were kind of uncharacteristic for Daniel or for Bogdana, and so they were flagged as potentially fraudulent. And so the bank sent notifications to both Daniel and Bogdana saying as much. And so Bogdana, she gets the messages that there have been these potentially fraudulent charges. She knows it was not her. And so she calls Daniel, but Daniel does not pick up. And so she texts Daniel, but again, silence from Daniel. Thinking this was a little bit odd, Bogdana reached out to Daniel's mother, Christine, knowing that Daniel and his mom spoke nearly every day, and so she filled the mother in about what was going on. And after getting all the information from Bogdana, Christine would try calling and texting Daniel, but still got nothing. And so she reached out to her granddaughter, Sierra, and so she calls Sierra. Sierra does not pick up. She texts Sierra asking to speak to Daniel, and Sierra does not get back right away, but eventually she responds to Christine. And the response just said his phone has been acting up, but he is okay. It should be fixed by tomorrow night. No worries. Now, Christine was relieved to read that her son and her granddaughter were just fine. But at the same time, there was just something odd about the fact that she could not get in touch with her son, and that Sierra was kind of acting a little bit cagey, not answering her phone, which was unlike her, and then sending a message that did not quite sound like her. But either way, Christine just let it go and figured she would be in touch with her son over the next 24 hours. But the next day, by 10 a.m., when Christine and Bogdana had not heard or seen Daniel, Christine again reached out to her granddaughter, Sierra. She called her, but she did not pick up, and so she texted Sierra, this time demanding that she put her father on the phone. But Sierra did not put her father on the phone. Instead, after a few minutes, Christine just got another text message that said something to the effect of, "My dad is in the shower, so he cannot talk right now." Christine, at this point, it was like her radar was up, and she knew there was a real problem. She did not know what it was, but there was a problem, and someone needed to go over to Daniel's house and make sure he and Sierra were okay. And so Christine contacted a woman named Peggy Newman, who was Daniel's landlord and a close friend of Daniel. And she asked Peggy, "Would you mind going and doing a welfare check at Daniel's house?" And Peggy would say, "Of course, no problem, but I will not be able to get over there for at least several hours." So Christine said, "No problem," but as soon as she hung up, Christine just was so anxious waiting to find out what was going on with her son that at 1:46 p.m., when still Peggy was out running errands and had not done the welfare check yet, Christine just called the police and asked them to do a welfare check. She explained to the dispatcher that her son had been missing for 2 days, that his work, his family, and his ex-wife had all tried calling, and nobody was answering, and nobody had seen him, which was completely unlike him. But as it would happen, just a few minutes after Christine placed that 911 call, Peggy Newman and a friend of hers actually arrived at Daniel's residence ahead of the police. And so when they got there, they hopped out of their car, they walked up to the front door, and as they were knocking on the front door, they looked over into the driveway, and they saw Daniel's car, which was a blue Nissan Altima, was not there. And so they were knocking. They were seeing the car was not there. It was totally silent in the house. And so Peggy, she reached down and she tried the doorknob and she found it was unlocked. So she twisted the knob, she opened the door, and she and her friend stepped inside. Just minutes later, Peggy and her friend would come running out of the house, and Peggy would call 911 because the police were not there yet, and she would frantically try to describe to the dispatcher what she had just seen. 24 hours earlier, a man and a woman were spotted on surveillance camera withdrawing cash from several Las Vegas ATMs using Daniel's debit card. Those were the withdrawals that had been flagged as fraudulent and tipped Bogdana off that something could be wrong here. After those withdrawals, the man and the woman were spotted again on camera going into a Las Vegas supermarket called Winco. And inside, they would purchase a few items using Daniel's debit card, and then they would leave and they would head to a Las Vegas Home Depot where once again they would be caught on camera purchasing a few items using Daniel's debit card. After these purchases, the man and the woman would make their way to Daniel's residence where they would spend the night. The following morning, Daniel's blue Nissan Altima car was spotted leaving Las Vegas at around 10:20 in the morning. That was about 3.5 hours before Peggy Newman and her friend went into Daniel's residence and then quickly turned around and ran out and called 911. When police finally did arrive at Daniel's residence on April 9th, and they pulled up and they saw Peggy Newman and her friend totally ashen-faced and pacing on the sidewalk, the police would get out. They would talk to those two. They would go inside of Daniel's residence, and they would see the horrible thing that Peggy and her friend had also seen. But the police could not make sense of what they were seeing. It really just did not add up. Then 4 days later, on April 13th, police in Salt Lake City, Utah, just happened to find the man and the woman who were seen on camera on April 8th using Daniel's debit card and going to the Winco and the Home Depot. The police, they just happened to find these people on a bus in Salt Lake City. And after going through the man and the woman's belongings, including their phones, the police would discover a video that these two had taken of themselves in the last couple of days that explained what was inside of Daniel's house. On this video, the young man is laughing and saying, "Welcome back to our YouTube channel. This is day 3 after murdering somebody." And then the young girl giggles and says, "Don't put that on camera," but then she smiles and says, "It was worth it." The young man and the young woman who were joking on camera about murdering someone were 18-year-old Aaron Guerrero and his girlfriend, 16-year-old Sierra Hulth, Daniel's youngest daughter. Allegedly, on the morning of April 8th, after Aaron and Sierra had pulled all that money out of all those different ATMs, They had gone to the Winco and purchased disposable gloves and bleach and drop cloths, and they had gone to the Home Depot and purchased a circular saw and saw blades and lighter fluid, and then they headed for Daniel's house. It has not been made public what actually occurred inside of Daniel's residence, but we can make a few assumptions. Daniel adored his children. There was no act there. He truly loved his children. And so it would never cross his mind that one of his children or one of their significant others would ever want to hurt him. And so when Sierra and Aaron went inside of Daniel's house, it would have been extremely easy to sneak up on Daniel or just kind of catch him off guard because he was not looking to put up a fight. He thought he was around people who loved him and respected him because he loved and respected them. But however the young couple did it, they would inflict up to 70 stab wounds in Daniel's body, most of which were in the back of his head. And then at some point during this vicious attack, they stuffed Daniel into a sleeping bag. And right in the middle of the living room of his house, they doused him in lighter fluid and lit him on fire. It is unclear what exactly killed Daniel or for how long he was actually conscious and aware of what was happening before he died, but it is very possible that Daniel had at least a small moment in time where he recognized his beloved little angel Sierra was actively trying to kill him. After Daniel was either dead or incapacitated, the young couple tossed their pocket knives into the sink. And then they retrieved their circular saw as well as a chainsaw and began attempting to dismember Daniel's body, but they were unable to do it. And so they just kind of set the saws down in the middle of Daniel's home with bits of Daniel stuck on the grooves of the saw. At that point, Aaron and Sierra attempted to destroy evidence inside of the house by scrubbing everything down with bleach, but it was totally ineffective. And so at that point, the couple decided they would just burn the entire house down and that would destroy all the evidence. And so around the time that Christine texted Sierra and demanded to speak to Daniel, and Sierra wrote back, "Oh, he is in the shower. He cannot talk to you right now." That was probably around the time that Sierra and Aaron were actively trying to burn the house down. But the fire they set was just not very big and it kind of smoldered out. And so they would just kind of leave all of the evidence all over Daniel's house, and they would leave Daniel's destroyed and burned body kind of propped up against the door leading into the garage, and they would just leave the house, hop in Daniel's blue Nissan Altima, and at around 10:20 in the morning they would leave Las Vegas. The only reason police were able to apprehend Aaron and Sierra in Salt Lake City a few days later was because the couple had made their way to Salt Lake City and hopped on a bus, and Aaron had not paid the fare, he had just snuck onto the bus. And so at some point, the transit authority had come through the bus, and they were asking people to show their tickets, and Aaron did not have one. And so when they discovered this, they asked for his name. And when they entered his name into their system, it popped up that the Las Vegas Police Department was actively searching for him. While only Sierra knows why she turned on the one man who would forever love her and would forever support her, what we do know is around the time that Daniel and Elizabeth had gone back to court, and they were having those virtual meetings with the judge to decide who was going to have custody over Sierra, Sierra had begun dating Aaron and she had fallen totally in love with him. And it seemed very much like Aaron had totally fallen in love with her. And somehow Daniel caught wind of the fact that Aaron and Sierra were planning to run away secretly and go move to Los Angeles. And so when Daniel heard this, he told his ex-wife Elizabeth, and then they would go and talk to Aaron's parents and they would tell them about this plan to run away. And both sets of parents talked and decided it was in both children's best interest if they stopped seeing each other. And so starting in early 2021, the parents forbade their children from seeing each other, and that was it. But even though all the parents were involved in this decision because Sierra was at the time living with Daniel, it seemed like she focused her rage about this decision on Daniel because he was the one kind of enforcing the rule. And so it is believed in April of that year, Sierra decided she would just have to kill her father in order to get her boyfriend back. In Daniel's obituary, his family very conspicuously left Sierra out, saying that Daniel was survived by 2 loving children, not 3. His family has also come out and publicly stated that they hope Sierra and her boyfriend are given the harshest penalty allowable by law. Despite the existence of this confession video that Aaron and Sierra took of themselves talking about murdering Daniel, they have pled not guilty and are currently awaiting trial. In 1989, 22-year-old Eloise Lindsay was a fresh college graduate, and she was at a crossroads in her life because even though she had just earned her degree, she really did not know what she wanted to do with her life. And because she was an experienced backpacker, she thought a good way to, kind of get her life together would be to go on a sort of retreat, go out into the woods, go out into nature, and kind of find herself. So, she had planned this very detailed 43.3-mile hike along the Appalachian Trail starting in South Carolina, where the first 7 days of the hike, she would be totally on her own. And then at the 7-day mark, she would meet up with a friend at a particular rendezvous point. Her friend would give her resupplies and would be her companion for the rest of the hike. When Eloise told her parents what her plans were, they were not concerned for her safety because she was an experienced backpacker. She had made trips like this before, and so they said, "Great, we will see you when you get back." So on November 4th, Eloise sets out to begin her journey down the Appalachian Trail, and the first couple of days of her hike were great. The weather was beautiful. The scenery was amazing, and she had all this time to just kind of be by herself and look internal and think hard about what she wanted to do with her life. But on the third day, when she woke up, she was sleeping inside of a tent she had camped just off the trail. She woke up and she had this intense sense of dread. She could not really place where it was coming from, but she knew something was wrong. And she was kind of doing inventory of her life, like, what did I forget? Is there something that I am just not thinking about right now? But she kind of pushes it aside mentally and thinks, okay, you know what? I am just going to pack up my campsite here and get hiking, and I am bound to, come up with what it is that is making me feel this way. So she gets out of her tent and she begins packing up her campsite. And she is looking out, kind of scanning the tree line, not because she was looking for anything, but just because she happened to be looking out and she could have sworn that she saw a man standing, 30, 40 feet away behind a tree. And she kind of did a double take and was staring at him. It is broad daylight, it is the morning, and they are near a trail. So it is not unbelievable that there might be someone near her at that very moment. But she kind of did a double take and she looked at them again and this person was gone. And she stood there for a minute, just kind of looking in the direction of where she had seen this guy, wondering, is my mind playing tricks on me? Did I really see someone there? Why are they not showing themselves again? If there was someone there, they clearly must have just been looking at me. Why are they not, poking their heads out again to communicate with me in some way? We are out in the middle of nowhere. We should be talking to each other. But the guy never shows himself again, and so as she is standing there wondering what she should do, she is not ready to yell out to this person because there is part of her that is a little bit nervous about yelling out to some stranger in the middle of the woods. But she starts to get this really intense feeling that she is being watched. And it feels an awful lot like the sense of dread she had while she was in the tent. And she is starting to wonder, are my instincts or is my sixth sense picking up that I am being watched? Like there is some predator out there looking at me right now. And even though she has no way of knowing if that is actually true, she is alone in the middle of the woods. And even though she is experienced, she cannot help but feel really vulnerable. And because this guy is just not showing himself again, she feels a little bit threatened. And so she begins to panic and she starts packing up all of her stuff as quickly as she can. And as soon as she can, she takes off down the trail away from that guy she saw in the woods. As she was walking down this trail, she could not help but think someone was right behind her, and she kept turning around to see if this person or whoever it was behind her and no one was ever there. But this visceral feeling that she was being watched, that sense of dread she had, it just was not going away. And so she started walking faster and faster. Before long, she was running and she is realizing that she is in a section of the Appalachian Trail that is very remote. She is not near civilization, she is not near her next rendezvous point. And so she is thinking to herself, I need to get off this trail. I need to get to a road. I need to get away from here as soon as I possibly can. And so her options were to continue on this trail for several miles, and it would probably take her until well into the night before she was going to reach civilization, or she could take a shortcut because she believed there was a road that was running parallel to her trail, but it was way down the mountain. It would require leaving the trail and basically cutting through the wilderness to get down to this road, but she was pretty confident it was right down there. And because this threat of this person or thing following her was so intense for her, she decided to leave the trail. She could not stand the idea of having to spend another night out in the middle of the woods with this person stalking her. And so she walks off the trail and starts running down the mountain. It was not long before she started to hear audible sounds coming from what she believed to be this person that was following her. And she would turn around and there would be no one there. And then she started to walk, trying to listen as she is walking, and she would hear footsteps far away from her. And she turned and there would be nobody there, but she was certain someone was following her. Someone was stalking her. And the sounds that were coming out of this person, this animal, whatever it was, they sounded like, a deep male voice, but she could not recognize if it was a language of some kind. It just sounded more like a grunt or a yell of some kind, and so her heart rate is elevated. She is panicking, and she is walking as fast as she can just through the middle of the wilderness, hoping she is walking towards this road. But after walking and running for miles into the middle of nowhere, she has not come to a road. It is now completely dark out, and she knows she is lost. And so she has to set up camp in the middle of nowhere, and she knows somewhere out in the middle of the woods is some person or something that is stalking her. And she is all alone. She has no way to contact anyone. She does not have a cell phone. It is 1989, and so she sets up her campsite and she gets in her tent. She zips it up and she lays there, hoping she does not hear any sounds. And sure enough, within minutes of being inside of that tent, she starts hearing those audible sounds coming from somewhere in the forest. and she hears what sounds like heavy footsteps walking around the perimeter of her campsite. All night long, she hears this, but luckily, they do not come up right to her tent. So there is some separation between her and whatever is making these sounds, and then finally, the sun comes up. She is out of that tent, packs it up, and continues running in the direction she hopes is the road. And of course, all day long, she has that sense that someone is watching her. She is hearing footsteps coming from behind her. She would turn, she does not see anything. She would hear that audible grunting sound, that low voice coming from somewhere behind her, but again, she would never see whoever it was or whatever it was that was making the sound. And then again, the sun is starting to set and she has not found the road, she has not found a trail. And she is thinking to herself, I cannot even backtrack because if I turn around and start walking backwards, I am bound to run into this very thing I am trying to escape. And so once again, she sets up her campsite in the middle of nowhere. She gets inside, and as soon as she is laying in her tent, she starts hearing those heavy footsteps somewhere out in the woods, kind of walking around the perimeter of her campsite. She is hearing that low audible sound that she cannot quite place. And at some point, she falls asleep. She gets up the next morning. She jumps out of her tent, packs it up, and starts running hopefully in the direction that will bring her to civilization. A couple of days later, when Eloise was supposed to meet her friend on the trail at the 7-day mark, and they were going to finish the hike together, well, Eloise does not show up. But after several hours, when Eloise did not show up, her friend left the trail and contacted authorities and filed a missing person report. And the police would launch this massive search for Eloise along the stretch of the Appalachian Trail where she had said she would be. And for the next 14 days, hundreds of police and volunteers and helicopters are scouring this area, and there is no sign of Eloise. And so after 14 days from the time her friend filed the missing person report, the police had to turn the search off, and they say, look, we cannot find her. 2 days after the search was terminated, so 23 days after Eloise had initially set off for her trek through the Appalachian Trail, a hunter who was out in the middle of nowhere near the Appalachian Trail discovers Eloise perched up against a tree. She is totally emaciated. She is dehydrated. She is delirious, but she is alive. At first, she was terrified of the hunter because she believed the hunter was this person that had been following her. But when she realized he was there to help, she went with him. She was brought back and brought to a hospital, and she was checked out, and besides being dehydrated and emaciated, she was okay. And she would detail in multiple interviews and in her official statement that she had been chased for the past almost 3 weeks in the middle of the woods, and she does know who it was or why they were chasing her. And then, interestingly, she said right before she was found, so a couple of days before this hunter finds her, this person, this thing, whatever it was that was following her, got so close to her a couple of different times that she was so scared she ditched her backpack that contained all of her life-saving equipment, like her sleeping bag and her tent, and it had some food and water in there. She ditched that so she could be lighter, so she could run faster away from this thing that was chasing her in the woods. So, you have got to figure you have got to be at such a high level of fear that you are prepared to ditch the one thing you really require to survive out in the wilderness, which was her pack full of supplies. And then after she ditched her pack and she ran for some distance, she had no supplies, no food, no water. She stumbled across this tree in the middle of nowhere that wedged inside the trunk was a cache of donuts and pound cake. And so she took the donuts and pound cake, and between that and the stream water she had found, that is what kept her alive for the last few days before she was found. Eloise says she has no idea what to make of her experience, and law enforcement was baffled by it as well. Some people think Eloise had a mental break and she effectively made this whole situation up, that she really was lost in the woods, but no one was chasing her and she was just kind of paranoid and running around the wilderness for a couple of weeks. Other people, including park rangers who work that stretch of the Appalachian Trail, believe it is possible she could have been stalked by wild men, which are basically people who live out in the mountains who are effectively feral, who live off the land. And they have been known, according to local legend, they have been known to attack park rangers, and people who live out in that area have claimed to have seen these wild men. And they kind of match the description of what she was describing. But as of right now, there is no official explanation for what happened to her other than she got lost and was found again. In September of 2004, 49-year-old Robert Springfield, along with his 2 teenage sons, left their home in Wyoming, bound for the Bighorn Mountains in Montana. They were planning to do some elk hunting on the Crow Reservation, which is the homeland of the Crow tribe, and Robert and his family were members of the Crow Reservation and therefore had the rights to hunt on that land. The specific spot the boys were going to be hunting was Black Canyon, a particularly steep and rugged area. But Robert was well equipped for this type of environment because he had previously served in the United States Marine Corps in their Special Operations Unit, which would have meant he would have received a very high level of outdoor survival training, which is perfect for living up in the mountains. Robert's sons had apparently learned a lot from him and were very competent outdoorsmen as well. They arrived at the reserve on September 19th and immediately headed out to do some bow and arrow hunting. Their plan was the two boys would break off from their father and head over to the edge of the canyon and attempt to drive elk down into the valley so their dad could take a shot at them. But late in the afternoon, the two teenage boys had not seen a single elk. And so it was getting to be time to head back to the prearranged meeting spot, and so they packed up their stuff and they headed there. The boys make it to the meeting area and their father, Robert, is not there. So they sit down and they begin to wait, and an hour goes by, 2 hours go by, 3 hours go by, still no sign of their dad. They cannot get in touch with him. They have no cell phone service. And so they are thinking to themselves, okay, worst case scenario, he got turned around and he will have to spend the night out in the cold. But he has got warm winter clothes on. He knows what he is doing. He will be fine. And so, as the sun was setting, the boys did finally leave to go tell authorities that their dad was, lost in Black Canyon somewhere. But it was just not registering for them that this could be life-threatening, that something really bad could have happened to their dad. He was just this Superman figure to them, and it just did not cross their minds. Authorities launch a search that night that includes the use of helicopters with thermal imagers doing low flyovers of the entirety of Black Canyon. Thermal imagers pick up a heat signature, and so anyone that is alive gives off a heat signature. And so at night, if you were flying overhead and you saw a person in the middle of a canyon where there is virtually nothing else around them, they would stand out like a bright light. But that night, the helicopters combed all over Black Canyon and they never saw Robert. However, authorities would say that, this guy, he is trained, former special operator, he probably went and found shelter. So, he could be inside of a cave, or maybe he made himself a shelter with tree branches and it is obscuring him from the thermal imager. And so, we will just have to look tomorrow. But the next day, despite bringing out hundreds of searchers and bloodhounds and people on horseback and more helicopters and planes flying overhead, there was no sign of Robert. And after several weeks of still not finding any sign of Robert, they ultimately called it off. The family was obviously crushed. But more than that, they were just dumbfounded. The idea that something bad had happened to Invincible Robert, that just did not add up for them. And so after the official search was terminated, they would continue to make trips into Black Canyon looking for their father, their husband. But unfortunately, like all the searchers, they never found any trace of him and eventually accepted that he was gone. 1 year later, in October of 2005, a hunter who did not know anything about Robert Springfield or the fact that he had disappeared, this hunter was in Black Canyon in the same area where Robert Springfield had disappeared. And this hunter is walking through this really dense forest. He is all alone. He is an experienced hunter, and he is not on a path. He is just kind of combing through the woods, and he starts to hear what sounds like a crow screeching. And at first, it does not really register with him. It is only in retrospect that he recalls this sequence of events. As he kept walking on, the screeching intensified to the point where he just could not ignore it. And so, he stopped and turned to listen to this screeching crow that he could not see through the dense forest, but he could tell it was in that general direction. This hunter said as soon as he stopped and he turned and began actively listening to this crow, he had this weird sensation that the crow was trying to actively communicate with him. It was a very strange experience. He had never had anything like it in his entire hunting career, and he spent lots of time outdoors. And so he felt like he had to go over and see what was going on with this crow, and so he starts walking towards the crow. He still cannot see it. It is very thick vegetation. And he is getting closer and closer, and he gets to a place where he can just barely see this crow. It is in a clearing. There is this large tree stump right in the middle of the clearing, and this tree stump is not short. It is like 6, 7, 8 feet high in the air. It looks like this tree had broken in the middle and fallen over. And this crow is sitting on the top of this kind of gnarled stump, and the crow is just incessantly screeching. And from this hunter's perspective, he can see the crow and he is kind of staring at it. And as the hunter is looking at this crow, the crow suddenly turns and looks directly at the hunter, and it recognizes the hunter can see the crow, and the crow stops screeching and is just staring directly at the hunter. And this hunter would say he felt so unsettled by the sudden behavior of the crow because it was almost like confirming the crow was looking for him, and now he had found him, and he stopped screeching and was looking at him. The bird continued to stare silently at the hunter to the point where the hunter felt compelled to walk out of the vegetation into the clearing to kind of confront the crow. And so he stepped into the clearing, and the crow the whole time is not screeching anymore, just looking at the hunter. And the hunter is standing in the clearing, and he looks at the crow, and the crow suddenly looks straight down. The hunter follows the crow's gaze down to the ground, and he sees at the base of the tree is a human skull. And the hunter is so taken aback by this, he looks back up at the crow, who is looking at him again. And the whole situation is so terrifying to this hunter that he just makes a note of where he is and he runs. As soon as the hunter got out of the woods and was back in cell phone reception, he called authorities. Authorities showed up and he showed them on the map where he had discovered this crow and this skull next to a tree. And sure enough, the authorities make their way out and they find the skull right under this tree. The crow at this point is gone. When they walked up to the tree stump, they discovered it was not just a human skull. It was also a human femur bone right next to the skull, and then next to that was a set of boots that had been placed right next to them, neatly next to one another. And then next to that was a belt that had been tightly wound up and placed next to the boots. And then next to that was a jacket that was not folded but was balled up, and inside of the jacket was a wallet containing cash and Robert Springfield's ID cards. The authorities launched a search in that area to look for the rest of Robert's remains, but unfortunately they were never recovered. Also, his bow and arrows were never found. The FBI was brought into the case because foul play was suspected, and they eventually determined that Robert must have been shot. And then they later recanted that statement and said, actually, he was hit by a falling tree. But if he was struck by a tree, then where is the rest of him? Wouldn't it have been in that area? And then why were all of his things neatly stacked? Certainly, he would not have done that after getting hit by a tree. So who neatly stacked his things after he was hit? And then also, where are his bow and arrows? But despite how improbable it sounds, that is the official theory, that he was hit by a falling tree. The family, along with many other people, believe he was attacked by someone or something up in those mountains. But if he had been attacked, his sons would have heard the struggle because they were in an area where sound carried really, really well. And if a person attacked him, why didn't they take the money out of his wallet? Also, where Robert's remains had been found was very close to where his original campsite had been with his two sons on the night he had gone missing. And so it was firmly located inside of the initial search grid. Meaning, had he been under a tree or been left for dead by some attacker in that area, he would have been found in those first couple of weeks that they were looking before the search was terminated. So, the fact that he was not found means either hundreds of people did not see him, including a helicopter with a thermal imager, or he was not there until after the search was terminated. And if so, where was he? And perhaps the weirdest aspect of this entire case is the claim by this hunter that a crow apparently lured him over to this tree stump where he found Robert's remains. If you believe this hunter's story, and many people do, then do you really think it is a coincidence that all of this took place on Crow Reservation, home of the Crow tribe? I think not. But will we ever know the truth about what actually happened to Robert? I do not know. On June 7th, 1951, two families from Santa Fe, New Mexico met up at the Santa Fe ski basin to have a picnic together and to enjoy the mountain air. During the summer months, when there is no snow on the ground, the Santa Fe ski basin is a very popular location for hikers because the terrain is very rugged, and if you get up to the top of the basin, there are these incredible views overlooking the valley. But on this day, the two families decided they wanted to have a picnic at the base of the basin, basically looking up the mountain. As the parents were setting up the picnic site, the kids started playing together, and that was Larry and Janet McGee, who were brother and sister, aged 7 and 5, respectively, and Stephen Cross, who was 3 years old. After they finish setting up their picnic site, they look around and realize the kids are gone. And they are thinking, we just saw them like 2 minutes ago, so they cannot have gone very far. And so they start looking around for their kids, and they cannot find them. They are yelling out for them, and they are starting to get a little bit more worried, and they start branching out farther and farther, and they realize the only other place they could have gone is up into the woods, which are very steep and very rugged. So they are thinking, well, they cannot have gone into the mountains. That would be impossible for these young kids to get very far, and they are not responding to our calls. It is possible they could have been abducted. And so one of the parents ran down to the main building of the actual ski resort, where they kept a staff member in there during the summer months, and they were able to get inside and use a phone, and they called authorities. So the police come out and they set up these huge spotlights that are aimed up at the mountain. And so the idea was, if the kids did get up into the mountain somehow, they would see these lights and hopefully walk down to them. After they set up the spotlights, the police began combing the side of the mountain in hopes that the kids were not abducted. But despite the spotlights and hundreds of searchers and people yelling out for these kids, they never heard back from the kids. They did not find them. And so all night they are looking for them, and they are realizing that there is a pretty good chance they are probably not here, and that means they probably were abducted. And so by the following afternoon, things were really starting to look grim. There was no sign of these kids anywhere. And that is when a searcher who was way outside of the primary search area, they were about 3.5 miles away, thousands of feet up in elevation. They are up there and they are looking around and they are getting ready to leave when they see something out of the corner of their eye that looks like a person. They turn around and one of the kids is poking their head up from behind a log. And the searchers run over to them, and sure enough, the 3 kids were actually inside of this downed log, and they were all okay. As the searchers are picking them up and calling this in, they are thinking to themselves, how in the world did these kids get so far away? Once the children were brought back down to the search headquarters and were reunited with their parents, and were checked out by a doctor who said, Yep, they are a little dehydrated, but they are okay. After all that was done, the police asked them the question that everybody was thinking: how did you get where you were found? And Larry, the oldest of the group, he was 7 years old. It took him a minute, but eventually he said, they were playing around the picnic area and they went just barely into the tree line when all of a sudden a bear came out from behind a tree and began chasing them. And the three of them ran 3.5 miles up a mountain to find this log, which they jumped inside of. And they hid inside of this log from this bear, which apparently was patrolling the area looking for them. And in addition to this bear that was apparently walking around the area looking for them, Larry said they were especially scared of the gorilla that was walking around the area looking for them as well. Now, it is easy to discount Larry and the kids' story because you could say, okay, well, the gorilla they saw was actually just a searcher looking for them, except there was no one in that area looking for the kids near that log until right before they were found. It was kind of like a last-ditch effort to push outside the boundaries of the main search area. It was just kind of a miracle they actually located them. And Larry and the kids were saying this gorilla and this bear were looking for them on the first day, and first night they were out there. So there were no searchers out there at that time. As for the bear, there have been bear sightings in the Santa Fe ski basin. Although it is fairly rare, but if it was as a bear that was chasing these kids, it would have caught them. A bear is not going to not be able to catch 3 small children running uphill. So either there was not a bear or it was some other animal that might have resembled a bear. But what type of an animal would chase 3 small children who are very vulnerable 3.5 miles up a mountain only to abandon them? But even if we say, you know what, there is no way the bear and the gorilla had anything to do with this is just kids who got lost and they wound up in the woods and they were found and that is it. Fine, but I have a 3-year-old and a 4-year-old and I can tell you right now, there is no way they could cover a 3.5 mile distance uphill in really rugged mountainous terrain in a 24-hour cycle. There is just no way. Without help, that is not possible. I would say the only caveat to that would be if my children were fearful for their lives, in which case adrenaline would kick in and they probably could cover that distance in a 24-hour period. That certainly lends credibility to the idea that Larry, Janet, and Steve were in fact running for their lives and they had that adrenaline kick, and that is how they were able to cover that distance. But were they really running from a bear or a gorilla? We do not know. And there has been no further investigation into this case. And I think that is because the kids were found alive, the parents, the police, they are happy, and everybody moved on. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And remember, we have a whole playlist of true crime episodes ready for you to binge right now. Until next time, see ya.